The day Mason Reed walked into the glass lobby of Langford Motors to ask for a mechanic job, nobody looked twice at his worn jacket or the creased folder in his hands. They saw only a quiet, broke single father with nowhere else to turn. But when the receptionist read his name aloud over the intercom, Amelia Langford, the Billionaire's CEO, froze behind the conference room glass. That name had once lived inside a classified report that saved her family's empire. Today, the man her company turned away was about to become the only person who could save it again. The morning was cold over Detroit, the kind of cold that crept through cheap jackets and settled into tired bones, and the glass tower of Langford Motors stood against the gray sky, like something built to remind ordinary people of exactly how small they were. Mason Reed climbed out of an old pickup truck with a dented fender and a windshield crack that had been there longer than he cared to remember, and he stood for a moment looking up at the building before he let himself walk toward it. He was not dressed like a man who belonged inside, and he knew it. His work jacket had been washed too many times, the cuffs soft and frayed, and the folder under his arm held a resume that had been printed, folded, and unfolded so often the creases had turned white. He did not walk in like a man with something to prove. He walked in like a man who had simply run out of other doors to knock on. Inside the lobby, polished concept cars sat under white light like sculptures, their paint so clean it looked wet, and a massive screen above the reception desk scrolled stock numbers and a photograph of Amelia Langford in a dark blazer, her expression unreadable, captioned with a headline about quarterly earnings. Mason barely looked at any of it. He was not here for the cars or the headlines. He was here for a single opening listed 3 days earlier for a mechanic position in the experimental test shop, a job that paid enough to keep the lights on and nothing more, and that was exactly the kind of job he had learned to want. On the walkover, he had checked his phone once, a reminder about a bill due at the end of the week. A small, quiet weight he carried without complaint, the kind of responsibility that shaped a man's choices without ever needing to be spoken aloud. The receptionist looked him over the way people look over something they have already decided not to take seriously. Polite enough on the surface, her eyes moving from his boots to his folder and back again with a flicker of something close to pity. She told him to take a seat near the side door, the one used by delivery drivers and maintenance crews, and Mason nodded and sat without a word, because arguing about where he was allowed to sit had never once gotten him anywhere in his life. A few minutes later, a group of younger applicants arrived. Sharp suits, polished shoes, voices a little too loud for a lobby, led in by a man with silver cufflinks and a smile that did not reach his eyes. Carter Blake walked past Mason without so much as a glance, the way a man walks past a chair he has no use for, and the younger applicants followed him toward the elevators, already laughing at something Mason could not hear. High above the lobby, behind a wall of soundproofed glass, the mood was nowhere near as light. Amelia Langford sat at the head of a long table, listening to Logan Pierce explain, for the third time in 20 minutes, that the new L9 engine program was on schedule, despite a string of failed stress tests that had quietly begun to worry everyone in the room except him. Logan spoke with the practiced calm of a man who had spent 2 decades learning how to make bad news sound like a minor inconvenience, and Amelia watched him with the kind of attention that made people nervous, because she rarely interrupted and she rarely forgot. She did not believe him, not entirely, though she could not yet say why. The door opened and Evelyn Hart stepped in quietly, the way she always did, carrying a tablet and a folder of her own. She apologized for the interruption and said the candidate list for the test shop mechanic position had come in, that there were only a handful of names worth mentioning, and she began reading them aloud in a flat, efficient voice meant to take no more than a few seconds of the room's time. She reached the third name on the list, and the moment it left her mouth, Amelia Langford went still in a way that no one in that room had ever seen before. For a moment, nobody in the room understood what had happened, only that something had. Amelia's pen, which had been moving steadily across a page of notes, stopped mid-stroke, and the color seemed to drain slowly from a face that was usually impossible to read. Her eyes, a moment ago sharp and impatient, now looked almost startled, the way a person looks when a door from the past swings open without warning. Evelyn noticed it first, the small tightening of Amelia's fingers around the folder in front of her, the paper bending slightly under the pressure. Logan Pierce heard the name too, and something in his posture shifted as well, though he recovered faster than Amelia did, covering the moment with a dismissive little laugh and a remark about how a mechanic's resume was hardly worth interrupting a board meeting over. Amelia did not laugh. She asked Evelyn to repeat the candidate's full name, where he had worked before, what his background showed. Evelyn admitted the file was thin, full of unexplained gaps, listing only experience in engine repair, drivetrain systems, and something labeled simply as experimental mechanical work, with no company names attached to any of it. Amelia said nothing for a long moment, because the name Mason Reed was not new to her. It had surfaced once before, years earlier, hidden inside a private file her father had left locked in his office safe, a file marked with a single warning across the front in his own handwriting that read, "Do not trust the official record." Inside that file had been a short, strange note, one she had read a dozen times without ever fully understanding it, instructing that if Langford Motors ever faced another engine crisis, someone should find a man named Mason Reed. At the time, grieving and exhausted, she had told herself it was nothing, a fragment of confusion from a man whose mind had begun slipping in his final months. But today, with the L9 program teetering on the edge of disaster, and that exact name surfacing in her own lobby on the same morning, the idea of coincidence felt suddenly very thin. Logan tried again to steer the meeting forward, insisting the board could not afford to let a low-level hiring matter derail a conversation about a multi-billion-dollar program. And for a moment, Amelia let her expression settle back into its usual composure, giving him nothing. But quietly, beneath the table, she instructed Evelyn through a short written note to hold the file, to keep it separate from the rejection pile that would inevitably follow, and not to mention to anyone, especially not Logan, that she had any interest in it at all. She did not yet know why she was protecting that name. She only knew that some instinct, old and inherited, told her not to let it disappear a second time. 2 floors below, Mason still sat near the side door, unaware that the sound of his own name passing through a speaker had just shaken the most powerful woman in the building. He checked the clock once, patient in the way only people who have waited for worse things can be patient, and he had no way of knowing that somewhere above him, a woman was staring at a folded piece of paper that had outlived her father, trying to understand why the past had chosen this particular morning to knock on her door. Carter Blake called Mason into a small interview room beside the test shop, the kind of room with fluorescent lighting and a table too narrow for comfort, and inside waited Carter himself, the chief engineer David Cross, and 2 junior staff from Human Resources holding clipboards they barely glanced at. Carter leaned back in his chair before Mason had even finished sitting down, looking him over with an expression that had already made up its mind. He asked, with a thin smile, why a man pushing 30 with such a broken work history thought he belonged anywhere near Langford Motors. Mason answered evenly, without flinching, saying only that he understood engines, that he understood machines down to the smallest moving part, and that all he was asking for was the chance to prove it. Carter laughed under his breath and said this was not some roadside garage, not a place for fixing old trucks in a gravel lot, and the remark landed exactly the way he intended it to. David, sitting quietly to the side, was scanning the handwritten notes in Mason's folder, and something caught his attention, a set of technical terms scrawled in the margins that went far deeper than anything a typical mechanic would know. references to thermal stability systems and torque feedback behavior in experimental engines. David opened his mouth to ask a follow-up question, but Carter cut him off before he could, steering the conversation back toward humiliation instead of curiosity. He pressed Mason about the gaps in his employment history, and Mason explained simply that he had been caring for his family after a difficult period, taking whatever work he could find to get by. He offered no further detail, no mention of a child, nothing beyond the bare outline of a man carrying responsibility quietly and without complaint. Carter seized on it anyway, suggesting that a man distracted by personal obligations could never handle the pressure of a corporate environment, his tone dripping with condescension. Mason did not raise his voice. He said only that machines did not care whether the man fixing them wore a suit or a worn-out jacket, that they only responded to someone who understood them. The remark landed harder than Carter expected, and David glanced up sharply, clearly intrigued despite himself. Annoyed, Carter slid an old fault diagram across the table, an outdated schematic from a previous engine failure, and told Mason to analyze it quickly, as though it were nothing more than a party trick to watch him fail at. Mason studied it for less than a minute before saying the fault was not in the auxiliary pump at all, but in the thermal valve control algorithm and a delayed sensor response buried deeper in the system. David sat back, stunned, because that exact theory had been quietly debated inside the engineering team for weeks, without ever being said aloud to anyone outside it. Carter immediately dismissed it as a lucky guess, refusing to let the moment breathe, and Mason did not argue. He simply stood, thanked them for their time, and reached for his folder. Carter told him flatly that he was not a fit for the company, adding, almost as an afterthought, that security could escort him out if he intended to waste any more of their time. Mason gathered his papers without a trace of anger on his face and walked out of the room with the same quiet composure he had carried in with. What neither Carter nor anyone else in that room realized was that the interview camera mounted in the corner had recorded every second of it, and 3 floors above, behind her office glass, Amelia Langford was watching the entire exchange unfold in real time. Amelia replayed the interview footage twice on her private screen, watching not for Mason's failure, but for something else entirely. The precision in the way he had read a fault diagram he had never seen before in his life. She did not see a candidate being humiliated. She saw a man deliberately keeping his abilities hidden, answering only as much as he had to and never an inch more. Like someone who had learned the hard way what happens when you show too much of yourself to people who are already looking for a reason to dismiss you. The way he had spoken about machines responding only to understanding reminded her, sharply and unexpectedly, of a note tucked inside her father's old files. She walked to the small personal safe behind her office bookshelf and pulled out a folder she had not opened in. Over a year, the one her father, Joseph Langford, had left behind before he died. Inside, it was the history of a project called Langford Phoenix, an experimental engine program from a decade earlier that had nearly bankrupted the company after a catastrophic failure during final testing. According to the official record, a young engineer named Mason Reed had been blamed for a critical procedural error that triggered the failure, and had vanished from the company before any formal inquiry could be completed. But her father's private notes told an entirely different story. In his own handwriting, Joseph had written that Mason Reed had been the one who discovered the fatal flaw in time, who had saved the testing team from something far worse, and who had then been quietly pushed out and blamed by someone determined to protect their own reputation. Amelia had never known which version to believe. Her father had died before he could explain himself fully, leaving her with nothing but a name and a warning she had never understood until this very morning. She remembered, with a slow and uncomfortable clarity, that Logan Pierce had been the project lead on Phoenix all those years ago. The realization settled over her like cold water, and for the first time she allowed herself to seriously consider that the man she trusted to run her engineering division might have built his career on a lie he had buried a decade ago. Evelyn stepped into the office and reported that Mason had already left the building, and that Carter had marked his file as unqualified before anyone else could review it. Amelia asked Evelyn to keep a copy of everything and quietly, without involving anyone else, to track down a way to contact Mason directly. Evelyn asked if she wanted him brought back in. Amelia hesitated, aware that if she moved too quickly, Logan would notice she was digging into something he clearly wanted left alone, and that hesitation alone might cost her the only lead she had. Before she could decide, an urgent report landed on her desk. The L9 prototype had just failed its latest heavy load simulation, and if word of the failure reached the press before the company had answers, the stock would not survive the morning. Amelia stared down at Mason's name on the page in front of her and understood, with a sinking certainty, that she had just let the one person who might be able to save her company walk straight out the front door. She moved to the window and looked down at the parking lot below, just in time to see an old, dented pickup truck pulling away from the curb, carrying with it the only thread connecting her father's last warning to the crisis, now threatening to unravel everything he had built. Inside the main testing floor of Langford Motors, the engineering team stood gathered around the experimental L9 prototype, the tension in the room thick enough to feel in the back of the throat. This program represented the single biggest gamble of Amelia's tenure as chief executive. If it succeeded, Langford Motors would lead the hybrid performance market for years to come, and if it failed, the company stood to lose a contract worth billions along with whatever credibility it still had left with investors. Logan Pierce pushed the team to announce publicly that the failure was nothing more than a minor software glitch, something easily corrected before the next quarterly report. David Cross pushed back, insisting that the irregular vibration patterns, the delayed thermal valve response, and the unexpected pressure spikes all pointed towards something far deeper than software, something rooted in the mechanical design itself. Logan brushed the concern aside, because admitting to a design flaw would mean reopening the entire approval chain he had personally signed off on, and that was a door he had no intention of letting anyone open. Amelia arrived to observe the next test run herself, standing just behind the protective glass as the engine roared to life. For the first few minutes, everything held steady, the numbers behaving exactly as the simulations predicted, and a quiet relief began to settle over the room. Then, without warning, an uneven rhythm crept into the engine's sound, a stutter so small most people would have missed it, but David caught it immediately and called for an emergency stop. Logan overruled him, insisting they push through the test rather than risk looking unprepared in front of the investors watching from the observation deck above. The temperature spiked sharply, the test rig shuddering under stress, and red warning lights flooded the control panel in rapid succession. Amelia gave the order to shut it down before Logan could object again, but the command came a few seconds too late. A secondary component ruptured inside the protective housing, the sound sharp and violent even through reinforced glass, and though no one was hurt, the message was unmistakable. The program was standing at the very edge of catastrophe. Outside the building, a technology reporter had already picked up a leaked fragment of the incident, and the board of directors demanded a full solution within 48 hours or risk losing the contract entirely. Carter tried to shift blame downward, pointing fingers at junior engineers who had nothing to do with the design, while Logan proposed hiring an outside international consulting firm at a staggering cost the board could barely justify. Quietly, away from the noise, David approached Amelia and told her something that had been sitting uneasily in his chest since that morning. The candidate they had rejected only hours earlier, he said, had pointed toward the exact same failure point before anyone had shown him a shred of real data. Amelia did not hesitate. She turned to Evelyn and gave her a single instruction: find Mason Reed immediately, whatever it takes. Across the room, unnoticed by either of them, Logan had overheard just enough of the conversation to understand exactly what it meant, and the name Mason Reed, a ghost he had buried a decade ago, was suddenly walking back toward him out of the dark. Evelyn found Mason at a small garage on the outskirts of the city, the kind of place with a single bay door and a hand-painted sign, where he took on whatever repair work came through to keep himself afloat between better opportunities. Inside, the space was tidy in a way that suggested someone who took quiet pride in order even when little else in his life felt steady. A utility bill sitting on a corner shelf, a small framed photograph turned face down beside it, enough to hint at a life lived carefully without ever pulling the story into the center of the scene. Mason was bent over an older customer's engine when Evelyn stepped through the open bay door, his hands moving with the kind of precision that came only from years of practice. Evelyn introduced herself as Amelia Langford's executive assistant, and Mason barely looked surprised by the visit, only asking, with a dry edge to his voice, whether Langford Motors had another engine that refused to tell the truth. The question caught Evelyn off guard, because he sounded as though he had already guessed exactly why she had come. She relayed Amelia's offer plainly, that the company wanted him back to consult on the L9 failure, that he would be paid generously and treated as an outside specialist rather than another applicant standing in line. Mason turned her down without a moment of hesitation. He told her that Langford Motors had already taken 10 years of his life once, had taken his reputation and his career, and had left him living under the weight of a mistake that was never his to carry. Evelyn did not know the full history behind his words, but she recognized immediately that what she was hearing was not loud resentment, only a pain that had been pressed down quietly for far too long. He explained that he had only come to the building that morning looking for steady work, not to rescue the people who had once thrown him away without a second thought. Evelyn did not push. She set her card down on the workbench and told him, gently, that Amelia was not like the people who had hurt him before. Mason looked at the card for a long moment before answering that Amelia carried the Langford name, and in his experience, that name had never once been innocent. After Evelyn left, Mason stood alone in the quiet garage, staring down at his old toolbox, the memories rising unbidden, the sound of an alarm he could still hear if he let himself, a forged signature, and a man who had turned his back at the exact moment Mason needed the truth defended the most. He thought of the years that followed, the doors that closed, the work that dried up once his name became attached to a failure that was never his. He closed the toolbox slowly, the metal latch clicking shut with a finality that matched the decision settling inside him. He did not throw Evelyn's card away, though, and he did not call the number printed on it either. He left it sitting on the edge of the workbench, neither accepted nor discarded, a small unfinished thread hanging between the life he had built for himself and the one that had once tried to destroy him completely. Logan understood immediately that Amelia was digging into Mason's past, and he wasted no time acting on that fear. He summoned Carter into his office and instructed him to scrub every positive note from the interview record, leaving behind only the phrase unprofessional, not a fit, as though that single line could erase everything David had quietly observed in that room. Carter agreed without much resistance, eager to protect his own position, though even he could not understand why a man as composed as Logan would grow so tense over a broke mechanic with no real leverage. Logan placed a call to a contact in the legal department, asking him to pull whatever remained of the old Phoenix Project files and quietly prepare measures to keep Mason away from the test floor if he ever set foot in the building again. He feared that if Mason got anywhere near the L9 prototype, he would recognize immediately that the current failure was simply an echo of the same design flaw from a decade earlier, one Logan had spent years making sure nobody would ever trace back to him. Meanwhile, Amelia quietly asked Evelyn to compare the signature on the old Phoenix incident report with anything they had on file for Mason today. Evelyn discovered something troubling almost immediately, a clear inconsistency between the signature that had once confessed to the original fault and the handwriting found on Mason's recent job application. David, working separately, returned to the archived technical records and found that several critical pages from the original investigation had been deleted from the internal system entirely, as though someone had gone to great lengths to make sure the truth could never resurface. Amelia began assembling the pieces in her mind, slowly understanding that her father had not been confused in his final months at all, that his warning about Mason Reed had been a deliberate attempt to protect a man who had been wrongly blamed for something he never did. Logan called an emergency meeting and proposed publicly announcing that the L9 failure had originated with an outside parts supplier, a story designed to buy time while quietly delaying the inevitable reckoning. Amelia refused outright, telling him plainly that the company could not keep building its future on reports built from lies. Logan's tone turned cold in response, reminding her that the board held the power to replace a chief executive if she allowed a flagship program to collapse under her watch. The room grew tense as Amelia realized she was no longer fighting a single engine failure, but an entire culture of concealment that had been quietly woven into the fabric of her own family's company for years without her ever noticing it. She left the meeting with her resolve sharpened rather than shaken, more certain than ever that she needed Mason back inside the building, whatever it cost her. Behind her, unseen, Logan picked up his phone and gave a quiet instruction to building security, an order that no one named Mason Reed was to be allowed back through the front doors of Langford Motors under any circumstances should he ever try to return. Amelia decided to go to Mason herself rather than send anyone else on her behalf. She traveled without an entourage, only Evelyn driving the car and waiting outside while Amelia walked into the garage alone. Mason was wiping grease from his hands when he saw her step through the bay door, and he showed no trace of the nervous deference most people reserved for someone with her name. Amelia introduced herself plainly, telling him she knew his name from a file her father had left behind. Mason asked, without missing a beat, whether she believed the official record or the words of a dead man. Amelia was quiet for a long moment before answering that she wanted the truth, whatever it turned out to be. Mason told her that the truth was never free, not because of money, but because of what it had already cost him once before. Amelia admitted that Langford Motors was in the middle of a crisis with the L9 program, and that she needed him to look at it. Mason refused again, the same way he had refused Evelyn, until Amelia reached into her bag and handed him a copy of her father's handwritten note. When his eyes landed on the line that read "Mason Reed saved us," something in his expression shifted for the first time since she had arrived. It was the first time in years that anyone connected to the Langford family had acknowledged the truth, even if only on a sheet of paper meant for no one else's eyes. Mason agreed to return, but only under 3 conditions. He would not sign any agreement of silence before examining the engine himself. Every technical finding would be recorded on camera as it happened, and if he uncovered evidence of a deliberately hidden flaw, Amelia would be required to reopen the Phoenix file publicly before the full board. Amelia accepted without hesitation. When Mason arrived back at Langford Motors, security stopped him at the entrance exactly as Logan had instructed. Amelia appeared at precisely the right moment, ordering the doors opened immediately. Carter spotted Mason walking back through the lobby and visibly paled, though he forced his usual look of contempt back onto his face out of habit more than conviction. Mason did not acknowledge him at all. He walked through the space the way a man walks when he no longer needs anyone's approval to prove his own worth. In the test shop, David handed him the full dataset on the L9 failure. Mason listened to an audio recording of the engine, studied the thermal curve for only a few seconds, and said quietly that the problem was not where they had been looking for it. The room fell silent. He asked for the third thermal valve assembly to be removed and the secondary feedback shaft inspected, a section of the engine the team had never prioritized in their investigation. David stared at him, stunned, because that exact area had never even come up in their internal discussions. Logan stormed in moments later, trying to stop the inspection, insisting Mason had no authority to touch company property. Amelia cut him off immediately, declaring Mason an official consultant reporting directly to her. As the engine housing came open, Mason looked at the structure inside and said quietly, almost to himself, that they had repeated the exact same mistake all over again. Mason began his inspection of the L9 prototype with Amelia, David, Evelyn, Logan, and the rest of the engineering team gathered around him, watching every move. He worked without showmanship, without inflated language, asking only precise questions that left even the most experienced engineers in the room falling silent one after another. Within the hour, he had identified a cost-cutting shortcut buried inside the thermal control assembly, a design choice that created a delayed response under light testing but became dangerously unstable the moment real load was applied. The flaw matched, almost exactly, a variant of the same failure that had nearly destroyed the Phoenix program a decade earlier. Mason told part of the story he had never spoken aloud to anyone at the company before. As a young engineer on the Phoenix team, he had discovered a design choice of Logan's that carried a serious risk of fire inside the testing chamber. He reported it up the chain immediately, but the data was quietly altered, a signature forged in his name, and by the time the final test arrived, the system had nearly exploded in front of the entire engineering staff. Mason had manually severed the reaction chain himself, a dangerous maneuver that saved everyone in that room, and was rewarded afterward by being made the one responsible for the very disaster he had prevented. Joseph Langford had suspected something was wrong even then, but by the time he began looking deeper into it, his illness had already begun to take hold, leaving the investigation unfinished. Logan denied everything Mason said, insisting he was fabricating a story out of bitterness toward a company that had simply let him go. Mason did not argue the point. He asked instead for the original archived Phoenix data to be opened in full. Logan claimed the data no longer existed. Evelyn spoke up unexpectedly, revealing that Joseph had once backed up a portion of the Phoenix files into his personal executive vault, and that she had recently found the access code buried inside one of his old handwritten notes. Amelia ordered the vault opened immediately, in front of everyone in the room. The screen filled with hidden technical records, including Mason's original warning report, time-stamped and dated months before the catastrophic failure ever occurred, proving beyond doubt that he had tried to stop it before it happened. An old audio file from Joseph was recovered along with the documents, his recorded voice explaining that if this file was ever opened, it meant the truth had finally come due. Logan began to lose his composure, insisting the recovered data could not be considered valid. David checked the file's metadata and confirmed the timestamps were authentic, not fabricated in any way. Amelia looked at Mason and understood, fully and for the first time, that the man her own company had humiliated that morning was not a desperate applicant looking for charity, but a man who had once been robbed of his entire career and his good name. Mason told the room plainly that the L9 flaw could still be fixed, but warned that if Langford Motors chose to bury the truth the way it had buried Phoenix, the company would not just lose another program this time. It would lose whatever was left of its soul. The board of directors demanded a public internal demonstration within 24 hours, a single test that would determine whether Amelia stayed on as chief executive or was quietly removed from the company her own family had built. Logan seized the opportunity, arguing in front of the full board that Amelia had handed a billion-dollar program to a man with a tarnished record and no official title within the company. Carter was called as a witness and did his best to paint Mason as an unstable, unreliable failed candidate who had no business anywhere near such an important decision. Amelia did not answer with emotion. She simply asked for the original interview footage to be played, the moment where Mason had identified the exact location of the L9 failure before he had ever been shown the company's own data. The mood in the room began to shift almost immediately. Mason walked in without a suit, dressed in his clean work clothes, carrying a revised schematic in his hand. He laid out his proposed solution clearly. Reconfigure the thermal valve assembly, recalibrate the secondary feedback shaft, and remove a false torque compensation command that Logan had quietly added years earlier to mask the flaw during simulated testing. David confirmed the plan was technically sound but extremely difficult to execute on such short notice. Mason replied simply that difficult did not mean impossible, not if the engineering team stopped protecting their pride and started listening to what the machine itself was telling them. The remark silenced several engineers in the room, not because it stung, but because every one of them recognized, somewhere underneath their discomfort, that he was right. The repair work began under enormous pressure. Mason directed the technical effort without ever talking down to anyone, assigning tasks according to each person's strengths, correcting mistakes with clear and specific guidance rather than frustration or blame. Amelia watched closely, finally understanding why her father had trusted this man so completely all those years ago. Mason was not only gifted with machines, he had a way of making even the most experienced engineers in the room believe in the truth again. Behind the scenes, Logan tried one last act of sabotage, quietly instructing a technician to delay delivery of a crucial component. But Evelyn intercepted the email and brought it straight to Amelia. Amelia secured the evidence immediately and ordered internal security to monitor Logan's movements for the remainder of the day. The L9 engine was finally restarted in front of the assembled board. At first, the sound came out rough and uneven, drawing visible tension across the room, and Carter allowed himself a flicker of satisfaction. Mason stayed calm, listening carefully, and asked for the load to be reduced by 3% before slowly building it back up in a steady, controlled rhythm. The engine settled gradually, the temperature dropping, the torque curve smoothing into something close to perfect. The test floor went silent for several seconds before David finally confirmed it aloud. The L9 had passed its first full heavy load test. Amelia turned to look at Logan, understanding clearly that saving the engine had only been the first step. Now she had to save the truth itself. After the successful demonstration, the board convened again behind closed doors. Logan tried one final attempt to shift the narrative, arguing that even if Mason had fixed the L9 engine, the shadow of the old Phoenix incident still made him untrustworthy. Amelia laid every piece of evidence her father had left behind onto the table in front of the entire board. Mason's original report, the recovered audio recording, the authenticated timestamps, and the forged signature that had never belonged to him in the first place. Evelyn presented documentation proving that Logan had personally ordered the alteration of testing data during the original Phoenix investigation. David confirmed, from a purely technical standpoint, that Mason's warning all those years ago had been completely accurate, and that if the company had listened to him then, the original disaster would never have happened at all. Carter tried to distance himself from Logan, insisting he had simply followed standard hiring procedure during the interview. Amelia reminded him coldly that arrogance was also a choice, and that his choice had nearly cost the company the one person capable of saving it. Logan was suspended on the spot, pending a full legal investigation into his conduct, but the emotional center of that day did not belong to Logan's downfall. It belonged to the moment Amelia stood before the entire engineering staff and apologized to Mason directly in front of everyone. She did not offer a vague or generic apology. She stated plainly that Langford Motors had taken his reputation, his career, and his good name, and had done nothing to make it right for 10 long years. Mason did not look triumphant. He stood quietly for a long moment, because no apology, however sincere, could simply hand back a decade of his life. Amelia offered to formally restore his professional record, provide financial compensation, and have his name permanently entered into the official history of both the Phoenix Project and the L9 program. Mason told her that money was not the first thing he wanted. What he wanted was for the official record to finally tell the truth, so that no lie could ever be used against him again. Amelia agreed immediately. The board approved the full restoration of his record and authorized an internal announcement before any public statement was released. A small, quiet moment about his life outside the company passed gently through the scene. Mason glanced at a missed call from home on his phone, but chose not to answer it right away. A small reminder that his everyday responsibilities had never disappeared, even as the larger story around him unfolded. Amelia asked whether Mason would consider taking on a special lead engineering role for the L9 program going forward. Mason told her he had only ever come to the building that morning asking for a mechanic's job, not a seat of power. Amelia answered that this time the company was not offering him a position out of pity, but because they finally understood the difference between simply repairing a machine and protecting a legacy. Mason accepted the offer on one condition, that the testing floor's entire culture would have to change so that no one would ever again be silenced for telling the truth about a flaw they had found. A few weeks later, Langford Motors held an internal technical showcase to unveil the fully repaired L9 engine. Mason was not transformed into someone flaunting newfound wealth or status. He stood dressed simply among the rest of the engineering team, while David presented much of the credit to the group as a whole, exactly the way Mason had insisted it should be done. Amelia stepped onto the small stage, and rather than focusing only on the product itself, she chose to publicly correct a piece of the company's own history. She told the gathered staff plainly that Langford Motors had once survived because of a man it had chosen to forget, and that today, the company was finally choosing not to repeat that mistake. Mason Reed's name was formally entered into the official Phoenix Project record as the engineer who had discovered the original flaw and saved the testing team from disaster. Logan faced a full internal and legal investigation for his actions, while Carter's role within the company was quietly reduced, the story choosing restoration over prolonged retribution as its true center of gravity. Mason did not deliver a long speech and did not raise his voice for effect. He said only that a strong company was not one that never made mistakes, but one brave enough to correct them before those mistakes destroyed it completely. The room fell quiet for a moment before the applause began, steady and unforced. After the event concluded, Amelia found Mason near the old retired Phoenix engine displayed in the lobby, its surface polished, but its history finally honest. She admitted to him that she had spent years living in the shadow of her father, afraid she would never be capable enough to protect the legacy he had left behind. Mason told her that her father had never left her a perfect company to inherit, only a single chance to choose the truth when it mattered most. Whatever connection grew between them in the days that followed stayed rooted in respect and earned trust, a slow and careful kind of understanding, with nothing rushed and nothing forced. At the end of that day, Mason walked out of the building through the main entrance, no longer directed toward the side door, no longer stopped at security, no longer treated as someone who did not belong. He received a short message from home letting him know everything was fine, and he allowed himself a small, quiet smile before slipping the phone back into his pocket and continuing on his way, the story keeping its focus exactly where it belonged. In the parking lot, Amelia called out to him and handed over a new identification badge, not a temporary mechanic's pass this time, but one that read Lead Mechanical Systems Consultant in clear, permanent print. Mason looked down at the badge, then up at the Langford Motors logo above the entrance behind her. He told her quietly that this time, his name needed to be written in the right place. Amelia answered that this time, she would personally make certain that it stayed there. The story closed on the image of the L9 engine running smooth and steady behind the glass of the testing floor, a quiet, fitting symbol of a truth that had been buried for far too long, finally allowed to stand in the light it had always deserved. If you want to know why one name could frighten a billionaire CEO, stay with this story to the end.
No! I'm trying to get as far away as possible. Oh my gosh. This is my best run. Oh my god, that's so annoying. I didn't just hit that right there. I really needed that to hit. Don't be greedy. Ow! I can't believe I actually hit that. Bro, I used 1 health. Bro, I've only used 1 health.
You have forced.
Holy shit. What's up, Ed? Not bad. Starting Pragmata, and I'd call it low-cal motion. I used 1 health. And I still have the baby head. Hold on.